Hi, everyone. My name is Alex Pond with the UNM Division of Community Behavioral Health. Welcome to today's webinar presentation for the Safety Planning and Seeking Safety Training for Behavioral Health Providers webinar series. A couple of announcements before we get started. Please make sure your sound is muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please submit them in the chat or feel free to unmute if Avi or Jen opens up the floor. For those requesting a CE or certificate of completion, I'll share an evaluation link at the end in the chat. In order to receive a certificate, you must attend the full presentation. Also, please note that the link will only be active for CEs for 48 hours after the presentation. If you have any questions regarding that, please feel free to reach out to me directly. And I'll now hand it over to Avi. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Glad you could join us. Jen and I will be meeting with you throughout. And we're going to now continue our discussion of safety planning. So just as a reminder, 2 weeks ago, we talked about risk assessment. Last week, we talked about safety planning as far as the overall structure and the purpose and why it has so many advantages compared to the typical kind of assess and refer model that we often use. And so today, what we're going to do is go through all the aspects of safety planning, except for lethal means access counseling, which is what we're going to spend most of our time next week, and then connect that to the rest of safety planning and sort of go over the overall structure. So today, what we're going to talk about is defining risk factors, protective factors, and warning signals. And Jen and I have mentioned in the past about the importance of distinguishing between risk factors and warning signs, because warning signs are really critical for people to know when they're getting into trouble, when they're more likely to be at risk for self-harm in any fashion, and when to initiate or think about activating their safety plan. And then specify, select, and apply at least 3 on my own strategies. So we're going to spend a lot of our time today talking about the first part of safety planning after warning signs, which is all the things that people can do on their own behalf. Because the typical, again, assess and refer model is very much like what professionals can do and what kinds of opportunities people have for crisis intervention or lifelines or helplines or warm lines or drop-in centers or aftercare or urgent care visits, et cetera, as opposed to things that they can do totally on their own without depending on friends or acquaintances or peers or family or professionals. So we really want to emphasize agency and self-control. And then talk also in detail about the with a friend, tell someone and ask for help coping. So we'll go into a lot of detail about this, but the with a friend is when you're connecting to other people who are not behavioral health professionals or healthcare professionals for distraction, for soothing, for a way of getting out of the negative space that you're in when you're stressed, when you're having difficulty coping, when you're having impulses to hurt yourself. And then the tell someone is looking at friends, family, peers, people in your natural support system, acquaintances, support groups, etc. When you're looking not just for connection and soothing and distraction, but you're also looking for advice or for some concrete help, like accompanying you to urgent care or to the emergency department, or helping you get transportation, or supporting your impressions of difficult relationships and getting guidance. And then only after all of those kinds of skills and techniques to reduce self-harm and optimize reasons for living and hope and optimism, if those aren't as successful as the person would like them to be, only then do we turn to the asking for help from professionals. And then after all that has been done by the people who are using their safety plan wisely and carefully, then we talk in our first time when we go through the safety plan about lethal means counseling. And we went through some of the reasons for doing that earlier, but we're going to reinforce that today and next time. So nothing to disclose, as you know, and we always like to start with reminders about how it's difficult to assess and predict suicidality and self-harm, but it's increasingly easier and evidence-based and effective in preventing suicide. And the main things that prevent suicide is all of us being well-trained in suicidality specific kinds of interventions, including safety planning and suicidality specific evidence-based therapies. And again, the references for all those therapies are in the reference section. And if you would like me to go into that detail further, just let your supervisors know, let Louis Millie know, and we can talk further about CBT for suicide prevention and the collaborative assessment and management of suicide model that I can give you greater awareness of, if not train you in some of the specific techniques. So training of our health workers, early identification and treatment, that's always the cornerstone of any kind of prevention efforts. Specifically with suicide, like we like to emphasize, reducing access to means, lethal means. Now again, that doesn't reduce suicidality per se, but it certainly does minimize the risk of if somebody makes an attempt, that the attempt is lethal and ends their life. And then responsible media reporting again, because problematic media reporting can exacerbate and perpetuate suicide contagion and suicide clusters. Whereas responsible media reporting does not do that nearly as much. And also more importantly, if we honor the wishes of the survivors of the suicide by what they wish to have reported, as opposed to report without their permission, we have less risk of promoting and having them develop prolonged, complicated, traumatic grief, which is difficult enough for any survivor of suicide. And then looking at harm reduction policies and procedures, like most notably with alcoholism and alcohol, and then follow-up. And the major thing that we wanted to emphasize with you over and over again is that within the 1 to 3 months of discharge from emergency room, urgent care, even residential treatment or an inpatient hospitalization that goes on for some time, that is the time when people who are intermittently suicidal are at greatest risk of making another attempt, much less greater risk of making a lethal attempt. So aftercare is absolutely critical. And again, one of the problems with our assess and refer model is that even if we make a reasonable referral, most often more than half of the people don't follow up at all or refuse follow-up because they've been given nothing except you don't need to be in the hospital, here's a number to call, as opposed to what safety planning does, which is forging a relationship and giving people the tools that they need so that when they're in a self-harmful or suicidal crisis, in that moment, they know what to do, their friends know what to do, and they have access to a wide variety of both natural and community and professional supports. So they're not left hanging about what to do, who to call, and how to approach things. So all those may not prevent suicidality, but they certainly prevent suicide. And the other thing that we emphasize over and over again is, contrary to a lot of myths that are out there, suicide crises are very short-lived. In some cases, like we talked about the last couple of times, especially for youth and young adults, the time between the stressor that provokes the self-harm and the decision that you want to end your life because you have no other solution that comes to mind, and then the action can be a few minutes, not day after day, week after week, with this concerted effort. And that, this is really important, 90% or more of the people who attempt suicide, including life-threatening attempts that they survive, do not go on to die by suicide. And the majority of the people who make a life-threatening attempt do not even make a subsequent attempt. So it's very important that if we learn how to prevent death in the moment when somebody is impulsively, reactively self-harmful and suicidal, then we can prevent suicidality in the future, and we can certainly do a good job at preventing death, suicide. The other thing that I always like to emphasize is in surveys of thousands and thousands of Americans all across the country, a significant majority, almost everyone, believed that suicide can be prevented. That's against the myth that people are hopeless as a society, don't want to talk about it, don't want to touch it. Actually, most people feel that if correct steps are taken and taken in a timely fashion, death can be prevented for those people who feel suicidal thoughts and impulses and feel that they need to act on them. And most important, that same overwhelmingly large group of people feel that if they knew that somebody was in trouble, and it could be even an acquaintance, but certainly someone reasonably close to them was feeling suicidal, they would want to step in and help. And that's, again, really important because the impression out there, the myth, is again that people stigmatize, shun suicidality, don't want to talk about it, are ashamed of it, don't want to offer any kind of help, are worried about offering help because they feel that they're in over their heads. And that's another thing that safety planning can do, is help people understand the boundaries of what they have to offer as friends, as family, as peers, as community supports, and all the professional resources that are available to support all of them in supporting the people they care about. So last week, we went into a lot of detail. I'm going to summarize this, but the problems with the assess and refer model, which we typically do in most medical settings and in most behavioral healthcare settings, is that what we do is it's clinician driven, it's one up, one down. We have a formula where we ask the questions in a particular order, and we're looking essentially at risk factors, deficits, disorders, history of dysfunction, and look at relative risk, focus mainly on should somebody need to or benefit from inpatient hospitalization, psychiatric hospitalization, or should they be treated outpatient? And we make a very binary decision. And like we talked about the last couple of weeks, we also make a very overly simplistic, reductionistic, binary either or kind of decision. We're not looking at risk for death. We're not looking at risk overall. We're looking very concretely and overly simplified as far as, does somebody want to end their life, and is somebody planning to do it, or have they made an attempt to do it, as opposed to, are they at risk for dying because of their behavior? Are they risking their lives in other ways and their health in other ways other than consciously, deliberately trying to end their life? So those are all problems. But another aspect of it is we don't give people any kind of tools in the moment. We don't intervene in any kind of way. And one thing I like to keep in mind, I tell all the people that I train all the time, is that when you look at general population, the huge majority of people see a behavioral health professional 1 to 3 times in a lifetime. And for those of us who work in behavioral health, especially inpatient units or residential treatment, we think of people who are in and out of therapy for most of their life and come in several times a week or week after week, month after month, year after year. But we don't realize that the majority of people, including a lot of people with severe mental illness and intermittent suicidality, who are at great risk for self-harm, may only see a behavioral health person once or 2 or 3 times in a lifetime. So we have to take advantage of when we see them, and just determining whether or not they need to be an inpatient or not, and then sending them out without almost no information or no support is not adequate if that's our only time to intervene. The other thing is that people come in to urgent care or emergency departments for this kind of assessment because they feel out of control. And other people are really concerned, if not that they personally are concerned, that the only solution that they feel is at hand is ending their own life. So what do? We have a process that does not honor their agency or their ability to self-manage. We're not curious about it. We don't ask about it. We don't coach it. We don't support it. We don't mentor it. It's totally clinician driven, and it's really, again, focused in this way about pathology and disposition planning. So it's totally the opposite of what people need. What they need is reassurance about all the natural supports that they have to offer themselves, their own ability to cope, their own values, their ambivalence about ending their life, the parts of them that still want to live, the parts of them that want to solve the kinds of problems that they're suffering from, and an exploration of that, an exploration of the meaning and purpose and value they place in life, an exploration of all their strengths, an exploration of all their natural supports, even if they're doubtful about their importance, about community supports like church care groups or support groups, all the rest of it, and then give them the tools that they have to make good decisions when they are impulsively, reactively suicidal, so that they don't kill themselves, so that they don't take that step. So for all those reasons, there's massive problems with the traditional thing where we do a very limited risk assessment. And like we talked about the first week that we met, most of our risk assessment is basically a screening. It's not even a risk assessment per se. And then the other thing is, if you look at the bottom of this slide, it's that very few people follow up in this model. But like we've talked about last time, with safety planning, the follow-through is much better for aftercare, for outpatient, and there's a significant, not just statistically significant, but felt significant to that person, a reduction in self-harm, in an increase in harm reduction, an increase in optimism and hope, an increase in attachment, and a decrease in hopelessness, symptoms of depression, substance misuse, and the rest of it. It's really stunning. And one of the studies that I talked about, which is at the bottom of the slide, is that a lot of people who attempted with only 1 dose of safety planning on a 6-month follow-up showed all those benefits. So one 20 to 30-minute intervention with very little aftercare showed great benefits. So safety planning is incredibly powerful when coupled with lethal means access counseling at reducing suicidality. So I'm hoping that you don't just assess suicidality, but risk in general, and that you always incorporate safety planning and all these aspects every time you see somebody and reevaluate somebody at risk. And the other thing I wanted to emphasize now, that we'll emphasize throughout, is that with any kind of intervention that we do, we always want feedback in the moment about what might work for them, what might not work for them, brainstorm about differences, ask them to come up with barriers and obstacles to implementing this. We don't just hand them a sheet of paper and say goodbye. What we want to do is say, does this resonate with you? Is this meaningful to you? What do you think you'll really do? And they might open up and say, none of it. And so then you have to go back and try to think what might be the most successful way for them to go through this. So brainstorm, look at alternatives, deal with obstacles, role play, mentor, coach. And then you end up with, at the very end, emphasizing what are their reasons for living. Now that they've gone through all of this, are they feeling in some ways more optimistic? Do they have a plan for if they have some kind of conflict with a friend or a family member or whatever typically drives them to harm themselves? Do they now feel that they have something that they can put into place immediately? That's almost just like they might have an impulsive act to hurt themselves. They also now have the impulse to help themselves and to move forward. So safety planning, again, was developed in 2012. It was consolidated. It incorporates a lot of aspects of crisis intervention, solution-based, strength-based kind of treatment. And collaboration is the key to this. It's a collaborative, shared decision-making, person-centered approach. It's totally the opposite of our typical medical model, which is directive, prescription, clinician-driven, and doesn't take into account the agency and the humanity and the personhood and the coping and the strengths and the values of the person that we're treating. This is what safety plan does. So it's definitely a collaborative, egalitarian, person-centered, shared decision-making, harm reduction, strength-based approach. So we recognize, again, in the sequence, warning signs, internal coping strategies, using social contacts for distraction from suicidal thoughts, using social contacts to help resolve the crisis in some way, or provide concrete support like emotional support to go in to see a therapist, or financial support or transportation, etc., to help them resolve the crisis, and then mental health professionals or agencies and all the resources there. And then we talk about reducing the potential use of lethal means. So again, collaboration is absolutely essential, like we talked about. And in our assess and refer model, rather, we leave them alone to struggle with all these issues, or we implant our own impressions, if not direct them by our, quote, wisdom and expertise, as opposed to their own expertise and wisdom. In this fashion, when it's collaborative, we're scaffolding again, and I mentioned that in times past, and it's the idea that we coach and mentor and support and draw from their own strengths, as opposed to prescribe, direct, command. And also, I didn't mention this before, but it's very important. Please eliminate the whole idea of non-compliant, right, or resistant kinds of issues from any of your work with people, but especially with suicide. What we need to say is when people are, quote, non-compliant, we're setting ourselves up as the experts on them. We're setting ourselves up as authority figures that they're opposing or defying. And we're saying that everything that we've come up with is what they need, and they have no say in it, right? And we also take ourselves off the hook because what we say is, well, the failure for them to benefit from it is because they're not doing it right. They're not doing exactly as we say, as opposed to what they're saying is, this does not work for me. This does not speak for me. You are not listening to me. You are not helping me. So what I would say is, instead of blaming the victim, right, by accusing them of being defiant and resistant, what we should say is, why am I not helping them speak to that side of themselves that wants to reduce their harm, support reasons for living, be optimistic about the future, and be hopeful. What am I not doing right? Not what are they not doing right? What am I not listening to? What am I not helping them? What kinds of alternatives can we both look at? So it's really important to reverse this. So they feel we're listening, we're caring, we're honoring their personhood, and we're supporting the best aspects of themselves, about moving forward, about coping better. Another way of saying that is, and it's sort of a mantra for all of those of us who do crisis intervention or short-term kind of work, as opposed to open-ended supportive kind of work, that what's important is what happens in the real world, not in our office, right? So we want to help support people function where they live, literally where they live, not just mentally and psychologically, but interpersonally, etc. So we want to honor their culture, their spirituality, everything that supports them. The other thing about safety planning is it's very, very flexible. It's been used all over the world with a lot of different cultures. As long as we have this close listening and caring for the other person, and we make it always person-centered, that it's not one up, one down. We try to be as transparent and ethical and egalitarian as possible. Then we have all these great results. Improvement, like I mentioned earlier, in suicidal ideation, behavior, decreases, measurable decreases in symptoms of depression and hopelessness, reduction in hospitalizations, reduction in emergency room and urgent care visits. And I can tell you, as far as administrators, when you're trying to say, like, let's implement that, and they'll go, well, is it really cost effective? If you can reduce hospitalizations and emergency room visits and lengths of stay in the hospital, you're demonstrating not just benefit to that person, which is, of course, should be our guiding mission, but you're also saying to a system, you can save money if you do this. You can not only save lives, but you can save money as an institution. So there's so many ways to sell this. You can deliver it online, in paper, in smartphones. It can be facilitated by a clinician, by all sorts of people out in the community. It can be done in groups, individually, and it can be done by that person alone. It's a standalone kind of intervention, or it can be combined with all sorts of other treatments. And like you know, the next phase of what we're going to be doing is talking about seeking safety, and how seeking safety as a treatment, one of the very first treatments for co-occurring disorders of severe mental illness, especially trauma and stress disorders, and substance use disorders, is about 80 to 90% safety planning. And lots of good stuff in seeking safety that you can use in safety planning. So here are the steps again. Warning signs on my own, with a friend coping, tell someone, ask for help. We're going to talk about all that now in the next half hour that we have together. And then next week, we're going to focus on reducing potential for use of lethal means access counseling. Put that all together, and then answer hopefully most of your questions about safety planning in general, sort of tie it all together as a preamble to all the time that we're going to talk about seeking safety. And then we'll end again our sequence of these 9 or 10 weeks with connecting seeking safety to safety planning, so that, for instance, in the On My Own Coping section, there's many handouts and many modules within seeking safety that are perfect for this. So we'll go into that. So again, here's a review of the safety plan template. And again, hopefully all of you have been with me and Jen the past couple of weeks, but you will always get a PDF of each PowerPoint presentation pretty much immediately following the presentation so that you don't have to worry about having all this information at hand. And for instance, for this patient safety plan template, there's a reference in the reference section specifically to this PDF. So it's again, warning signs, thoughts, images, mood, situations, behavior that a crisis may be developing, internal coping strategies, people in social settings that provide distraction, people whom I can ask for help, professionals and agencies, making the environment safe, which is lethal means access counseling. And then the very last part of it, the one thing that is most important to me and worth living for is. So again, we're trying in this stage-wise way of enhancing agency, enhancing harm reduction, building reasons for living, supporting the installation of hope and optimism, and reducing reasons for dying and reducing risk factors. What is the most important thing I need to remember about why I should live? So we talked last time about risk factors versus warning signs. So again, risk factors are what we know when we study populations who are at risk, et cetera. And it's focusing a lot on contextual factors, past histories, individual factors, co-occurring disorders, the propensity of certain disorders to be highly associated with suicide and suicidality. So as an example, within mood disorders, more people who have major depression attempt, more people who have bipolar depression or bipolar disorder make a lethal attempt than those who have major depressive disorder in and of itself. People who have personality disorders, notably borderline personality disorder, who suffer from that, often have chronic suicidality associated with that. People who have both a stress disorder or a history of trauma are more likely to have self-harmful kinds of practices, including substance use. So you know all that, I think, intuitively. One of the things that's, again, a problem with our risk assessment is we have somebody who comes in feeling overwhelmed with hopelessness and despair and misery in their mind. And what do we do in our history taking? All we do is focus on the misery that they suffered and that their family suffered. All the risk factors. We don't talk about protective factors. We don't talk about strengths. We don't talk about coping. Another problem, so here we are emphasizing nothing but problems, no solutions, and offering them no solutions, and then saying, so where are you now, right? Safety planning is the opposite of that. So one thing I always like to emphasize, by the way, is that for any population, so if you look at populations, for example, American Indians, people who live in structural poverty, people who live in under-resourced, underserved areas, LGBTQ, all these populations that are under-resourced, underserved, stigmatized, discriminated against, traumatized, have a higher risk of suicidality. But there is nothing inherent in being LGBTQ, queer, or gender fluid, nothing inherent in being American Indian, nothing inherent in being poor, and in a stigmatized class, or being a refugee, an immigrant, or being a victim of trauma, whatever it might be. If you are offered support that counteracts stigma and discrimination and discounting, you are at the same risk as the general population for self-harm. So it's really important not to look at these populations that are risk factors and say that there's something inherent in who they are that results in them being more at risk for self-harm. It's really larger structural, sociocultural factors that lead to that. And one example just now, is that in Texas is threatening to deny any kind of affirmative care to trans and queer and gender fluid youth. And they are threatening to report parents who support that affirmative therapy to child abuse. Since that intent of that law was announced, suicidality in that population, not just the youth, but in their parents, quadrupled. So that's a great example of this cultural pressure to stigmatize and discriminate, and all of a sudden that population is at much greater risk. Not inherent in who they are. So I have a long list of risk factors. I think you're familiar with most of them. Again, you'll be getting the PDF. And the protective factors, we also went through last couple of weeks. So I want to emphasize those. I wanted to alert you again to the fact that there are reasons for living inventories that were developed first by the DBT team at the University of Washington, and then the Collaborative Assessment and Management of Suicidality team, which stemmed from the DB team at University of Washington. And this will help prompt you in the kinds of questions that you can elicit reasons for living for adults, for the elderly, and for youth. This is just a very partial list. The reasons for living inventory is, I think, like 80 to 100 items. And it's not questions, it's just when people are struggling to come up with ideas, you can talk about these as suggestions. Now, warning signs. This is what's really important. This is what says to that particular individual when they're feeling really stressed, really hopeless, and the parts of themselves that feel hopeless, worthless, helpless, and feel the only way out of their suffering or their conflict or their difficulties or their trauma is to end their life. Or in a more nebulous way, just not wake up, just not have to deal with things, numb themselves to the point where they might endanger their life. And it's different for everybody. Like we talked about when we think of when we're all stressed out, some of you talked about not wanting to exercise. Some of you talked about getting off of your diet. Some of you talked about being more irritable or sensitive to relationships. Some of you talked about being more angry. Some of you talked about not wanting to be as connected, feeling like you were socially more withdrawn. So it's different for everybody. And again, when we just apply a template to everybody and say, here's the risk factors for people, we're not being helpful because these warning signs can be so different and idiosyncratic for somebody. Okay. So we recognize those personal, specific situations, thoughts, images, thinking styles, moods, and behaviors that tell somebody they're on a path that's really problematic and difficult. And that it's very hard for them to contemplate some way of seeking safety, reducing harm. This is, like I mentioned last time in our medical model, this is what we say, well, these are the circumstances when if you're an asthmatic, you use your rescue meds. If you're a diabetic, you check your sugar. If you're having sleep difficulties, you follow your sleep hygiene plan. It's like the precipitant, the activator for when you put a plan into action in a positive way, right? That's what a warning sign is. Safety planning doesn't work unless we identify what those warning signs are, because then people don't know when to initiate their safety plan. Any questions about that that you have that you'd either like to type in the chat or that you'd like to unmute yourself and ask before we move on? Does everybody feel comfortable about how to help people identify what the warning signs are? Is that basically a thumbs up? Okay, good. I'm seeing a bunch of smiles. So let's move on to on my own coping. And again, like I put in bold, these are activities a person can do on their own. They don't require any interpersonal or financial kinds of resources. It's meaningful activities that distract them and make them feel better. So what we also want to talk about here is that the absence of symptoms or the reduction of symptoms is not a life worth living. So we're not looking at the absence of symptoms. What we're looking at is the presence of connection, attachment, hope, optimism, safe coping, reasons for living again. So this is all to take people out of the space of ruminating and dwelling and exacerbating reasons for dying. And distraction, again, is terrific. We don't have to counter necessarily those thoughts or those behaviors. We just have to get out of that space in the moment. And that's something that people can more easily do. If a person is able to cope on their own, even briefly, this increases self-efficacy and self-control. And again, why most people attempt suicide is feeling totally out of control. Life is out of control, and they have no ability to stop that inevitably downhill cycle. Then again, like anything, always examine roadblocks to using these strategies and problem solve ways around them. So, for instance, if somebody says that aromatherapy is the thing that they really like, and they don't have the money to do that, they don't have transportation to do that, they don't have the resources to do that, then we can come up with other things like, the traditional meditative thing of peeling an orange, which can, or some kind of citrus fruit that releases those aromatic oils. Most people might have that, right? Or it can be going outside and smelling, flowers, or nuzzling with an animal whose scent that you like, or something like that. You can be creative, in other words. So look at all the time, whenever you offer any kind of intervention, always look at roadblocks, obstacles, barriers for them doing it. Also check into their motivation. Is this something that they're actually likely to do? People in the moment says, oh, that's a great idea. But then you have to pin them down and say, well, it might be a great idea, but does it really speak to you? And do you think you'll actually do it when you get home? Not really. And then you have to look further. Okay. So check for barriers and obstacles and check for motivation. And until you and that person, it's more important that they are satisfied that they find a couple of things that not only move them and speak to them and will reduce their reasons for dying, but they'll actually do. It's within their capacity to do. And I probably mentioned this before, but in problem-solving treatment and behavioral activation, which are core parts of both CBT and DBT and ACT, all the sort of cognitive behavioral therapies, what problem-solving means is, first, when people list problems, you look at what's important to them and what they feel that if the problem was reduced or removed, they would feel better. So that hierarchy of importance. But then you look at what's within their capacity to do and what's within their own control to do. So for instance, if I have a super conflictual relationship with someone, and my view is that there's nothing I can do, they have to totally change. Well, that's all well and good, but that means I'm at the mercy of their change, right? That nothing's going to change unless they do. As opposed to, here's all the ways in which I can minimize the conflict and enhance our ability to connect in a positive way. So we have to look at both. So when people are listing roadblocks and stuff like that, we have to attend to, what's within their own control, within their own agency to change, and emphasize those things that don't depend on others. Not wanting to help oneself, in other words, being hopeless about helping oneself, can be a roadblock that we have to deal with, right? And one suggestion, like I mentioned earlier, that's really helpful is that solution-focused kind of way of looking at two things. One thing is that instead of attending, like we've talked about in the past, to the worst time when they were most suicidal and most self-harmful, what we want to look at is when there was a situation that came up that typically really stressed them out to the max, that somehow at that particular point in time, they coped better. What was the secret then? Not what was leading to this cascade of misery and they felt at worst. And that's typically, again, when we do our risk assessment, we look for the absolute worst times. What resulted in hospitalization? What was the most potentially lethal attempt, et cetera, et cetera. So what would be like, let's say that you have, you're on the outs with a close friend and you feel that they're overly critical or overly distancing or discounting, whatever it might be that was negative. And normally you would storm off and feel desperate and want to take pills. But somehow you had the ability, or they created the opening, that you could talk about it openly. And they said that they were sorry that you interpreted it in this way, they didn't mean it in that way, and you felt a lot better. What was different about that? Why did you feel that you could talk about it? How did they give you even subtle hints that they were open to talking about it or wanting to correct your misinterpretation or whatever it might be? So that's the same thing as when somebody says they don't want to help themselves, always go back to that part of it is that there's a part of them, right? They're always ambivalent. So there's parts of them, they showed up. They want to talk to you about how they want to cope, right? They're wanting to listen to you. So what part of them feels that they want to help themselves? And that's something that you can easily support is somebody actually showed up for an appointment, whether they were dragged there, by their parents, or even if they came by an ambulance, if they're talking with you, there's some part of them that wants not to die, right? So that's something that you really want to focus on. Now, as far as the categories that are often looked at about these on my own coping strategies, there's distraction, soothing, and physiological. So distraction is, again, when you're doing something that has nothing to do with whatever you're experiencing that's negative. It's being in a different space altogether. It can be things like, playing spelling bee or Wordle, or Sudoku or something like that, doing some kind of puzzle. It can be listening to music. It can be helping out. And one of the things I think we all know is that the sense that we have something to offer other people is an incredibly important way for people who feel desperate and worthless to feel that they have some worth. And by injecting some kind of caring towards other people, we increase our capacity to care for ourselves and to have compassion for ourselves. So helping out with anything, it can be, helping out in a food bank, or it can be walking somebody's dog and taking care of their dog because they're bedridden with some kind of illness, using humor, mindless kinds of things, counting, reading, repeating songs or games, remembering lyrics of songs, that kind of thing. Anything that pulls you out of that space. And one example that I like to give is, a lot of you know about capsaicin ointment that's used for people who are arthritic. It's not helpful for joint pain at all. Capsaicin is the active degree in red chili peppers, right? And so people put on the ointment and they get a burning sensation that's different from the pain that they have. So they're focusing on that sensation as opposed to their pain, and they feel better. It's sort of a medically induced distraction technique. So distraction is a wonderful thing. It's not to be minimized. Soothing is when you do something that's comforting to you. You can use any of your senses to do that. And we know this whole thing about hugging people fills us with all sorts of endorphins and oxytocin and connection and good feelings and reduces our stress. Seeing and hearing things that are wonderful to us, walking meditation, being out in nature, all those things, being mindful of that sensation. So it's a mindfulness-based technique, essentially. It's also self-soothing. And then physiological, we know that, for instance, relatively brief periods of intense exercise, as little as 5 minutes of aerobic exercise 3 times a week, reduces symptoms of major depressive disorder, right? So aerobic exercise is really helpful. Progressive muscle relaxation, paced or deep breathing exercises, and all these things have smartphone apps. They help calm the body from that stressful fight and flight response, so that part of ourselves that doesn't feel desperate in the moment can then be more activated, and we can look back in a metacognitive way and say, well, this isn't the worst thing in the world. And there's a lot of reasons why I don't want to abandon my family, my friends, my pets. I don't want to hurt myself. I'm really worried about the consequences. If I take pills and they paralyze me as opposed to kill me, what kind of life would that be? All sorts of protective factors leap to the fore once that stressful, anxious kind of way of being is minimized and reduced. So Jen, could you offer us some suggestions and some wisdom about these 3 categories? I know that you've worked with a lot of people who have been stressed. What's on the list and what's not on the list that you think people should consider?
Yeah, I think that there's different ways that we might talk about this. Like, so I don't want us to get like too stuck on language and what falls into like what specific category. But I think that there's a couple like models that have informed me that I imagine that some of us are familiar with, like with DBT skills, for example, thinking about like the tip skill specifically, like how that relates with like the physiological aspects of like, you know, the temperature change, you know, something like cold water on the face, intense exercise, paced breathing, like the 4x4 breathing, and then progressive muscle relaxation. So there's these ways that these skills have been really like researched and demonstrated to be essential to this aspect of my own coping. I know some of folks on the call this morning too are familiar with like the community resiliency model, because they have rolled that out in the emergency room and in the inpatient units. So with that, there's grounding, which can go into some of these different strategies as well, like thinking about, you know, different types of grounding that can be soothing, where we're focusing on you know, places of contact with the body, putting that intention of the intensity on the inside, and then putting that, like in the way that distraction is putting that attention on the outside, where we might be engaging with the 5 senses. So soothing is really this sensory experience. And that when someone's really activated to go inward and to notice sensations on the inside can sometimes be too overwhelming, right? Like if we were to go directly into breathing, sometimes that might not be an effective strategy if we're kind of exploring with someone who we don't know quite yet, who we're still getting to know. We haven't had a chance to safety plan with them before. We might want to start first with grounding before we start doing mindfulness activities. Because when someone's beginning to track on the inside how they're feeling, we want to make sure that that they're oriented to the place and feeling comfortable. So with distraction, you know, sometimes there's mindless distraction. We could talk about just doom scrolling or whatever, right? Everyone sort of has a sense for what mindless distraction can be, and and how important it is to have that awareness, that distraction of bringing the attention back to the music, being mindful about what music we're listening to, sometimes helping people just kind of talk that out. Even music without words can be really helpful, especially if someone's trying to lie down and rest to go to sleep. If that's the time throughout the day they're distracted, and then at night this is when it really becomes the most difficult, when they don't have these activities that they're doing. So I think that these three categories can be really helpful for us to conceptualize the different models that we're doing, to kind of keep it simple and clear when we're working with clients, so that we're not sort of overwhelming them with handouts, where we're kind of exploring and seeing what are ways in, what do they already know that we can elicit, and then with people who are maybe trained with like things like EMDR, different somatic models, like resourcing is important. Tell me about your dog. What's your dog's name? What's your dog's fur like? So someone's beginning to use these different aspects of distraction and soothing to think about, as a resource, a person or a place, a higher being, a religious figure, a place by the river.
You've given us a lot to think about. We just have a few minutes left, so I want to move on. But I wanted to underscore one thing that Jen said that's really important is, again, in this process, it's very collaborative. So like Jen is saying, it's not like we want to flood people with our ideas and our handouts. We're just giving them some basic suggestions and then saying, well, what kinds of things speak to you? The other thing I wanted to underscore is, like Jen knows, is that a core module in seeking safety is grounding and centering. And the handout for that and the exercises for that, there's soothing, grounding and centering, there's physical grounding and centering, etc. And in our seeking safety talk, we're going to spend a lot of time going into all that. So what we're both trying to say is there's a huge wealth of resources, but what we're trying to do is to encourage that person to brainstorm about what speaks to them, as opposed to giving them this exhaustive list of what we think is best, right? So like Jen talked about, depending on your own experience as a provider, there might be certain ways in which you're biased towards certain things or think that things are special, but what's important again is to make it centered on that person and what speaks to them. So,
and like just being able to practice it together in that moment together, I think is really key.
That's right.
Even if it's just for 60
that rehearsal.
seconds.
Yeah. And so we won't have time to go into all the details of with the friend coping. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. The tell someone is who you would contact in a crisis and how to problem solve those obstacles. And then looking at all the professional resources. Next week, we'll summarize all this. And if you have any questions on these aspects, again, what we do then is move to lethal means counseling. So thanks for joining us. And I'm going to have Alex talk to you a little bit about getting continuing education credit and the PDFs. And I'm going to go down to the last slide, which is the QR code that you can use on your smartphones if you have them. And you see all the references and all that. Thanks for joining the two of us. And we'll see you next week to review some of these sections that we just alluded to and focus again on lethal means counseling, and then look at how we can use motivational interviewing and solution focused and problem solving to better enhance the possibility of people following their safety plans. Thanks, everybody.